Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
How do we as individuals, I was just wondering that, how do we as individuals in the African American communities that don't have these platforms to educate from have a direct impact on these socioeconomic issues that are hindering our communities? Like, what tangible steps do we take now that we have a definition of the problem, but when we're not in those places to teach from, where do we go?
To summarize in brief, it's pretty much what are your marching orders today if you don't have the platforms of yesterday to stand on?
In part, when you talk about education, as my colleague Dr. Lang mentioned, the barbershop, the beauty salon, I have get-togethers with my friends, but we're always finding time to make sure we are educated on the issues. It's the same thing with my children. I allow them to watch the news to a certain point. I have to be mindful of all the events. But then I ask them, okay, what did you learn from that segment we watched? So education is anywhere and everywhere. Not to put my business on the street, my mom on family vacations used to educate me in the car. She would have little books and things, and as we would pass farms, as we would pass landmarks, she would ask me questions. Education begins with you, and it's about revolution. Remember, revolution is not violent. It's just when you start to change your mind.
Yeah, I can. And I'll make it quick. Just quickly. I mean, I think one of the biggest mistakes that you can make is to assume that ordinary people don't have the ability and the power to impact things. And I studied the civil rights movement, and you have lawyers, you have school teachers, you have clergy, but the movement was peopled by folks who were janitors, who were domestics, who were sharecroppers, and those people moved mountains. I mean, there in several cities and states that I know of, for example, you have people now who are involved in efforts to roll back these laws where if you're an ex-felon and you fill out a job application, you have to check that black box. That's occurring in various kinds of areas. If we think about the last election, and again, I would argue that black politics is not just simply the vote, but I think we have to be struck by the fact, if we think about just that voter turnout, and I would argue, and this is just my opinion, that I think that turnout had less to do with Obama than it had more to do with the fact that people were responding to these voter ID laws. And in fact, people came out because, oh, okay, you're getting in the way of the vote, so I'm going to stand in line 6, 7, 8 hours. My mom, I put her on the spot for a little bit. She voted in Indiana in the last election, and she's got stories to tell you how she had to drive all over this place, and Indiana can be a dicey place for people of a certain hue. And so, I mean, so you have these kinds of things occurring. But the point is that people are on the move, and the best thing I could say is to sort of echo the sentiment. You engage in dialogue with folks, you figure out something that you're interested in, and where you feel like where you're situated, you can intervene in, and you find people, and it could be 5 people. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the most cutting-edge organizations of the Civil Rights Movement, was a very small organization. And you just find a couple of folks who are of like mind, who are interested in working on that issue, and you take a piece, because none of us can do everything, but all of us can do something.
Hello. I had a question, 2 questions actually, but I'll start with one, with Mr. Gibson. Yes, when you were saying that the black land ownership post-Civil War compared to today, okay, the question I had was, we got the 40 acres and the mule, and there were a lot of black farms, and for whatever reason, I was wondering, when you calculated the current rates of black land ownership, did that figure include like urban housing tracts, or was it just rural farming land?
Mostly rural farming land, and let me just add Let me just add with the 40 acres and more, it was mostly looking at rural land, because most of my area of study kind of concentrates itself prior to the 1940s. So during that transitionary period of a lot of African Americans leaving the South, moving to northern communities. So I'm looking at rural areas. But one of the things with the 40 acres and a mule, just to add clarity, we're still waiting. We're still waiting. It was in discussion, and actually you had land during the Civil War that was actually parceled out to slaves because the landowners left, but once the war was over, slave owners returned and reclaimed their land. And so what you look at, this transition of land ownership from the Reconstruction period to the early part of the 19th century, in part, and understand, slavery, we call it the peculiar institution. There's no one single definition to define what slavery was. You have evidence of some landowners, former slave owners, giving land to their slaves. You have evidence of slaves through the early stages of the sharecrop system working to pay their debts and becoming landowners themselves. And so there was a lot of resilience among African Americans immediately following the Civil War, not only economically, but also politically. That's why we started to see a lot of the laws change to suppress African American progress.
Okay, time is allowing for one more question, and I know that I have one in the back.
Could you take two?
Thank you. We are at the crossroads in history, and I strongly agree that one of the cases coming before the Supreme Court this year is the voting rights renewal. Also, I'd like to ask the question is, in our local community, to educators, community people, especially those who are members of the NAACP, voting in our community is one that we almost have to be ashamed of. We've had some elections where maybe the outcome could have been different if we had more people come out and vote. What are educators and activists to do about people in our own community who have that right, as so many of us have marched and some have died for, will put a TV program or many other things before the right or the opportunity to vote?
Well, Jesse Jackson said, "Free your mind, and you're behind the ball." I mean, it's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of being taught to preserve our history and legacy, so you know what those priorities are. Du Bois said that we were so busy trying to get on that train of desegregation that we weren't looking at where that train was going, and it's a train wreck. And so that even though that society is desegregated now, it doesn't mean that everything in the society is for us. And so I think it is about, the education that Lyle talks about here, is the education that I give my kids, and I think it's the education that we've been brought up with as an African American people, and we have to continue that because our priorities. Why can't I get kids to take classes on African American history? People fought just in the 60s so that we would have black courses in our university, but no one wants to take the classes. They only want to take the class to get the degree, to get the job, to make the money to work for someone else. So I still think it goes back to education and Carter G. Woodson, the miseducation of her.
Well, I'll just say this, and I'm going to be provocative a little bit in saying this because I'm old enough to have to have had some dialogues, who have studied the civil rights movement, but young enough that I've been in contact with a number of folks who sort of come up in the 80s or what have you. And I do think, though, we have to deal with the fact, and I go back to this point, that oftentimes if people are sort of if the effort is to mobilize people to simply vote, I think that, I would argue, is not by itself sufficient. Because I think that people, in some cases, for good reason, are very cynical about the electoral process. They're cynical about A, the choices that they have, and B, cynical about what their vote, what their vote does. Now, again, I'm not arguing against people exercising the right to vote. That's a very sacred and important right. But I go back to the point that I think that our conversations about politics have to simply be more than just the election cycle. But we have to talk about what's happening between there. And we have to talk about more than just simply electoral politics. So.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank NAACP for bringing together such a great panel. Thank you so very much. You just touched upon just a little bit about what my brother and my friend Joe Maddox said. I know what it means when we don't vote. 2007, when I ran for mayor, less than 300 votes between me and Mayor Funkhauser. But I always say to Sly James, if I had won, he wouldn't be mayor. My question is, do you see a correlation between the manner in which the black male slave was treated during slavery and what black males are doing to each other today as it relates to violence?
We're probably going to do this in 3 parts. That is a weighted question. I can start by just sharing just some of my own research experience about, and I'll put it within the context of the black family. Slavery was the most devastating thing to happen. And what I'm talking about is the international slave trade. And I'll say that within the context of resistance and struggle, resistance began time that first net was thrown, that shackle or rope was put around the hand or the wrist, and you began this system of oppression. And through laws, understand, our entire existence in this country ties back to laws. We are a manufactured group of people. Heredity of slavery was determined through the mother. So it allowed slave owners and white males to do what they wanted to do. But when a child was born, that child would have to take the status and the heredity of the mother. And so you created, over time, this matriarchal system within slavery, where the woman had a peculiar role. And it's not to say that men were always absent, but in many aspects of our plantation society, they were female dominated. Oftentimes the father may have lived on a separate plantation. So to fast forward, is there a correlation then and today? The short answer, you could say yes, because when you talk about stripping the male of his masculinity during slavery, you still can apply that to stripping the male of his masculinity in the penal system today. But once again, that's a heavy question. I'm not trying to run from it, but the short answer is yes.
And I would just add to that I see it as also the commodification of the black body and of the black male body, because we were bought and sold. There's a recent article, and I posted it on my Facebook page earlier this week, where there was an article about how we love hip hop, but do we love black men? So we love the things that black people can produce, but not necessarily the people that produce it. So I think there was definitely a line of history here where black people and black men have been marginalized. And actually, and going back to the economic question, there are less black men in the, they talk about people giving up looking for work, that there are less men in the workforce and looking for work than any other time. So if you think about black bodies as a commodity, or anything that we produce as a commodity, black men are marginalized, unfortunately.
I'll respond quickly to that. I'm going to try not to dodge it, but two parts. I mean, I think the first thing is that I've lived in a number of cities in several different states, and the thing that I always see, to the extent that I've been involved in black communities, is that they're concerned about schools, they're concerned about economic opportunity, police, community relations, and what have you. So I say that to make this point, that one of the things that's remarkable to me, that despite all of the issues that we have going on in black communities, and I assume you're responding to gun violence, one of the things that strikes me is the incredible resiliency of black families and communities, and I think sometimes that can get lost in these conversations, so I want to say that. But the second thing, and I'll make this quick because I know that time is short, that I think that part of what Dr. Gillis said is very important. If we think about sort of the growth of a number of these issues that we're dealing with today in terms of sort of rates of gun violence, what have you, I don't think that it's an accident that it's occurring at the same historical moment where we've had both a flight of jobs, of industry, right, and also a broader disinvestment in the social welfare of the citizenry. We have record unemployment, not just black, we have record unemployment, but the dialogue in Washington, D.C. is about debt. And so I think that in that context, I think that I'm not saying these things are good or that there's an excuse, because no one can stop black people from killing black people but black people. But there's always a context. I was born and raised in Chicago, and that's been in the news. There's been a lot of talk about all the gun violence that's happening in Chicago. But what doesn't occur in that conversation about the gun violence is that occurs at the tail end of a massive program of gentrification and the dislocation of black communities and families. And so to talk about what's happening in these communities without talking about the context, to me, and I'm not saying, sir, that you were saying this at all, but I think oftentimes in these conversations it becomes, in my mind, it's a very lopsided conversation, because I think context, I think environment, these things matter. They're not excuses for behavior, but they do set a context. And if we don't talk about jobs, if we don't talk about decent health care, if we don't talk about how do we protect those people who are not in a position to protect themselves, almost 40% of black children in poverty, what about our elderly, right? And we know now that we have, as a result of mass incarceration, you have women who are in their 50s and their 60s. They're taking care of their children, they're taking care of grandchildren, and sometimes they're taking care of their parents, and nobody's taking care of them, right? And so I think all these things tie together.
Thank you so much. If you would go